Good. Hi. Hi, all. I'm Marilee Wheaton, Systems Engineering Fellow at the Aerospace Corporation. As Brad said yesterday, I'm very honored to be the Vice President for the new BAME CSSC that we're forming. I also am currently the President for NCOSI, the Premier Systems Engineering Organization. And I had the very great honor of being able to introduce Dr. Paul Nielsen today. Most of the folks I know on this call know Dr. Nielsen, but just to remind you about Paul's contributions, he really in his career has had a variety of roles. He's started as a physicist, he's been a system program manager, he's been a military research associate. I think most folks know is director and CEO of Software Engineering Institute, which he's had that position since 2004. In addition, he is a fellow of AIAA, IEEE, and NCOSI, very similar to Barry in that vein in terms of a multi-hyphenate fellow of multiple organizations, and also similar to Barry, he's a member of the National Academy of Engineering, which is the highest honor that an engineer can receive here in the US. He has been very active in NCOSI since getting the fellowship there, and he was on the core team for just recently published Systems Engineering Vision 2035, which was just put out this year. And he is a longtime participant in the Center for Systems and Software Engineering. He's been there when it was CSC, been there for the colloquium to change it when it added systems. Longtime participant in GSOL, which is the other main workshop that Barry has founded, the one sponsored by Aerospace Corporation on ground systems. We see him there every year. So he is definitely a lifetime friend and colleague to Barry and to all of us. And we're just really glad to have him here today to be talking to Barry and his impact on software and systems engineering. So over to you, Paul.
Well, thank you, Mary Lee. That was a little longer introduction than I expected. I guess that means I'm really getting old if it takes that long to go through so many things, you know. Recently, I went to the undergrad to the U.S. Air Force Academy, and reunions are a big thing there. And just about 2 months ago, we had our 50th reunion of my class, which does say it has been a while. 50 years since I graduated undergrad, and it was nice to see everybody, but it does mean there's a passing of time. As I look on the screen and see either the faces or names, it's so fun to see all these names, except it would be more fun to be in person with everybody, and having a coffee or a wine or a beer or having a meal together. It'd be really nice. And I think Barry would have really loved it if we could have done that. But, the way things are these days, it's hard for everybody to get together. But it's really a joy to see all of you. So it's my honor to be able to talk about Barry BAME, his life, his contributions, his legacy, and all of us are part of his legacy, which is kind of interesting, I listened to Rick Selby's keynote yesterday, and he did such a good job of outlining his career and all the things he did that I'm not going to do that. No use to having two of us do that. So I'm going to try to add a little bit more color, some personal experiences that I know of or that others have shared with me, and some other aspects of his life. Because as we were talking earlier, as Carol was getting us talk, all of us are multi-dimensional people. Sometimes we just know each other for our technical work, our professional work, but we all have more than that going on in our lives all the time. And that's one of the great joys of getting to know people so well. Now, we certainly know that Barry was one of the titans of software engineering, one of the real legends. And I've seen a lot of stuff on the internet about Barry being legend, software legend. It's all up there right now. He kind of was at an interesting time in software engineering, as you all know. I mean, he was pretty early to the party. He wasn't the earliest. Ada Lovelace was out there a lot earlier than him, like 100 years before him. And I even looked up to see how he related to Grace Hopper, who's another person we always think of in software engineering. And Grace Hopper was 29 years older than Barry. I didn't realize that. She was really early to the party, But Barry is in a wave of people who really made a difference. And they're the names we all know that kind of are within 5 or so years of Barry's birth. You think of Fred Brooks, who was a little bit older than Barry, but not much. Watts Humphrey was a little bit older. Then, got Barry, got Margaret Hamilton, who was who worked on the SAGE system and Apollo system for both Lincoln Lab and then the instrumentation lab, who's kind of an icon. And then Vic Baselli, Larry Druffel was about 5 years younger than Barry. Ivar Jakobsen, Capers Jones. It was a cadre of about 8 to 12 people that really propelled software engineering forward at a time before we even knew to call it software engineering. So they were there sort of at the birth of this as a profession, and that's an exciting time. It's also a big responsibility, and I think of all those people, man, Barry may have been the one who contributed the longest in the most different areas. Now, he came to software engineering, as all of us know, from a strong mathematical background. In fact, his degrees were in math from Harvard and UCLA. And of course, at that time, there weren't degrees in computer science or software engineering, so people had to come from other areas. And I think this foundation that he had in mathematics really gave him a special view and a special focus as he went through his career on quantification and rigor in work. That was very important. I think these two aspects really highlight his work throughout his career. And of course, he was at Rand early, but I think this mathematical background really helped him focus on software engineering economics in the beginning, on looking for value and looking for costs and how to relate the two and how to measure the two, and to really put some discipline into this almost cowboyish thing of writing software at the time. Now, Rick Selby was speaking about Barry's career yesterday, and it made me think back to when I first knew about him and met him. And I first really learned about him in the early 1980s when I was working at an office that had this long title, the Secretary of the Air Force's Office of Special Projects. And whenever you have something that's called special projects or something like that, they really don't want to tell you what they do. That's just code for, we don't want to tell you what we do. But I was working in LA on satellite programs, and Barry at that time was in TRW, just down the street from us. And that's when he was really hitting his stride in, his book came out in '81 on software engineering economics. Kokomo, there's the early seeds of Kokomo were being planted then, because TRW was involved in a lot of big software programs, especially in the space business for the Air Force. And estimating costs was hard. We weren't so sure. This was a new era, right? And software was really hard at the time. It was growing fast. Our ability to estimate the cost, the schedule, when we were going to finish, all that was really not going so well at the time. I was a young major working on onboard software. And one thing easier about that is that there wasn't that much on board at the time. Because, a big computer at the time might have 64K of memory on board because of radiation hardening things and all that. But some of my buddies in this office were working on the ground system software, and that already was getting huge. And almost every one of those programs was late, and almost every one of those programs was overrunning. It was really in the late 70s, early 80s, that the government started to realize they were having a software crisis, and they had to start doing some things about that. And in the midst of that, there was Barry, who really was bringing things into a quantitative way and improving all our ways of estimating software. Now, my friends and I, as I mentioned, we were all struggling. Software was delivering great capabilities. People were very excited about it, but the size of programs, the cost of programs, and schedules were just not that good. It sort of sounds familiar now, doesn't it? We still are having problems with many of these things, especially as software is exponentiated in size and become interconnected to almost everything now. Everything's almost connected to everything else right now, right? But Barry really was even in that early time, almost 40 years ago, a light in the darkness. And that's one of the things I remember all of us talking about, how this guy, Barry Boehm, Dr. Boehm, he sort of knew what was going on and he was going to save us from all this. He gave us guidelines, he gave us rules to estimate cost and schedule. He started to take the mystery and the magic out of it and made it into more of a discipline, which was really good. That software engineering economics book came out, which was so important. All of us, that's like almost like the Bible of software engineering right now. And Kokomo came out to help us a lot with more standardized tools. Of course, it led to an industry of companies that actually work on estimating costs and improving cost estimates today. And the thing I remember is even then, in the 1980s, early 1980s, he was also looking at the techniques that would lead to the spiral model, the incremental commitment model. And those early things actually are what evolved in the limit to Agile, DevOps, and CI/CD kind of models that we use today. So 40 years ago, he was already lead turning the engineering field into what we're using today as our best software engineering techniques. That's just amazing when you think about it, The first time I really met him was in my next job, not while I was in special projects, but I was now at Hanscom, and I was a program manager for a program that a lot of people in the space business don't really like, and that was called SPADOC, the Space Defense Operations Center. And it was a troubled program from the beginning. It was one of the first programs to try to break down the wall of what was called the waterfall technique. We tried to develop our software in blocks. Now, they were still in their own right big blocks, but we had 3 blocks. Now that would be like 130 blocks if we were doing it in a CI/CD way. But we tried to do it in this block approach in what was called evolutionary acquisition at the time. I met him at the TRW facility in Colorado Springs, and I was the program manager for SPADOC at the time. He came in and just wowed everybody, with his thought, with the depth of knowledge he had, with his ideas, with Kokomo and how he's estimating cost for the program. And to the credit, the TRW part of that program went swimmingly well throughout the time. The lead contractor on that program was Ford Aerospace, which I think later became part of L3 many years later. I think that's right. But the software that TRW built came in on time, reasonably close to its budget and everything, and worked well in Cheyenne Mountain. I think in addition to him being a rock star, and just being kind of in awe of him when I met him, I remember from the very beginning that he really was the same Barry that we all knew later on in life. He was kind. Boy, that's one thing to remember about Barry. He's a really kind man. He, of course, was competent. He was curious. He was always looking at, asking that next question, which a great researcher does and a great PhD advisor does, right? Sometimes it's frustrating because you want the questions to get answered, but he always had another question, And he also was very collaborative in the way that he worked with people around the industry, whether they were government people, if he was in TRW, whether he was working with the government, with academics, or in his later jobs, he was in the government working with industry and academics, or later still as an academic working with industry and government. So he was always those 4 things in my mind, and that was great. And bios and resumes show lots of things. They show your accomplishments, they show where you were, but they really never show some of these other characteristics of a person, which are really so important. How kind was he? How respectful was he of other people's ideas? Was it easy to deal with him? Did he spur you on to better and better things? Another really mark of a great PhD advisor. Did he raise your game up? And I think he raised everyone's game up that he met with. That was really a wonderful thing about him. So I think about him a lot in that regard. Now, I mentioned, SPADOC was tough. Gosh, It was a program that ultimately ended up being late. It's much maligned in the space industry, but they tried to replace it like 3 or 4 times, and each one of those programs failed. So it ended up doing its job for about 30 years before it ultimately was replaced. After his TRW years, he moved on to DARPA, which is, just one of the highlighting jobs for anybody in the government as far as a technical job. And he led the Information Systems and Technology Office. And a lot of people don't know the history of DARPA, but this was the office that in a previous incarnation developed the internet, when Bob Kahn and Vince Cerf and others were there. So he was in charge of a department that was just really important at a very important time in history. 89 to 92 is while he was there. Things were changing. This is when the internet went from being a closed government academic system to being a commercial system. And all that we know of the internet today exploded on the scene at that point. That's when it became commercial, when you could build a company like Facebook or Google on the back of the internet with almost none of your own infrastructure to start. And so it led to all this inventiveness and innovation that's come up since 92. So at that time, I was in OSD, just down the street from him, and I was working in an office called the Office of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for C3I, big command and control programs, communication programs. And we were dealing with DARPA and his office all the time on these things because we wanted the latest technology. We wanted the innovation to come in. I worked on Milstar at the time, which Mary Lee probably knows pretty well, and also on something that, a program that never went called Space-Based Wide Area Surveillance. Some pieces of that are out there now, but it didn't really make it at the time. But we continued to look to DARPA and to Barry for the latest ideas of how to do these programs and to do them right. Now, at this point too, the SCI was around, because the SCI started in 84 and Barry got to DARPA in 89. And Barry was, his office was the program manager for SCI at the time, because initially when SCI was formed, DARPA was the manager of it. So he was dealing quite a lot with the SCI director at the time, Larry Druffel. And Larry and Barry became great friends, and they're still great friends. And one of the color commentaries is how they both love tennis, and they both were pretty good at tennis. But Barry was better. And I think that frustrated Larry a little bit, because Larry was about 5 years younger than Barry. And they would play in Santa Monica, they would play in Pittsburgh, they would play at the Army Navy Club in DC when they were there. They played all around the world when they were at conferences and stuff. And Barry almost always had the edge, even as Barry got up there in age. He was so smart on this stuff. Sometimes an older player, even if they're not quite as mobile, they've played so much tennis that they know where to put the ball and they know where the ball is going to come back to. So they can just run you ragged. So I talked to Larry this week just to find out a few things about the tennis part of their relationship. And he said, toward the end, I did start to beat him sometimes, but not all the times. But Barry was always a gracious loser as well as a gracious winner. And I know some of you were talking earlier about how even the students would play him and they'd be surprised at how competitive he could be in tennis. This does remind me, if you like some color about Barry, please look at the November-December issue of IEEE Software, which has a little tribute to him. And it's got 3 short little articles written by Ipek Eskaya from SCI, Larry Druffel, now retired down in South Carolina, and Bill Curtis, who's living down in Texas and works for CISQ and all that right now, because each of them has some nice memories of Barry and his life and all that he meant to them. So please look at that if you can. As Barry left DARPA and moved to Southern Cal, I was just moving to a series of my last Air Force jobs that all were in the heart of software engineering, cybersecurity, and AI engineering, such as it was in 92. AI wasn't quite the same in 92 as it is now, but there was a lot of emphasis on it then. that's when some of the early ideas of statistical basis of AI came up. But also it was a time when people were really worried about expert systems and trying to look for rules-based AI. I was at Rome Lab, then I was in NORAD, using the systems that I'd built before, like SPADOC. Then I was at ASC, as Mary Lee said, and then at the Air Force Research Lab. And in all those jobs, we had a strong relationship with Barry and his people and how things were going. He was always a person to touch base with a couple times a year, just to find out where things were going, what his students were working on, what he was working on, what was going on in the whole world of software engineering. And he was generous with his time, always, to help us stay on top of those things. I also thought it was really important, to start to notice the impact not only Barry himself was having, but his growing list of doctoral students who were, out there in the world again. And, if you're a thesis advisor, a doctoral advisor, one of your great legacies is the living legacy that is your students that goes out there. And he did a wonderful job of that. I mean, some of them are on this call. We all know others that aren't on this call right now, but who have continued to contribute and do a tremendous job. And that will be a perpetual legacy for him. So when I retired from the Air Force in 2004 and came to SCI, now I've been here 18 years, I ended up working much more closely with Barry again. He was on our board of visitors for 30 years, including my 18 years until the very end. And, we'd have monthly phone calls, biannual, semi-annual meetings in person that he would always come to and always share his wisdom with, always give us good advice. But I also, got to work with him closely on his annual research reviews, on the Kokomo conferences, on the seeing him at ICSI when we'd go to that, the International Conference of Software Engineering, seeing him at all the NCOSI events that we would get to go to as I started to get more involved in NCOSI, and at the CSERs that were out there. And also collaborating with him on the CERC, and I mean, this guy had energy. He never stopped. He always was ready to do one more thing, right? Yeah, I can do that. And he always, added to the conversation when he went. He wasn't just a guy sitting in a chair. He was always someone adding to the knowledge, adding to the energy of the group. And he was just an inspiration to me. He is a little older than me. I'm getting up there in age myself. But to see him continue to work as he, and to continue to contribute has been something that I keep thinking about. I don't know that I ever want to retire. I want to work through this. It might be in a different capacity. Nowadays we all seem to be healthy enough that we can have second and third careers if we want. And to continue to contribute to the knowledge base is just a wonderful thing, and to help others. And Barry inspired that in me. Now, he got lots of awards, as we all know, and Rick went over those the other day. He was a fellow of AIAA, IEEE, ACM, and COSI. He was a member of the National Academy. There's all kinds of individual awards he got too. Those fellow type awards are usually for a lifetime, but he got all kinds of other awards, honorary doctorates and that. And, as many as he got, I'm sure he deserved more. I think he deserved more when you look at all the contributions he had. But for me, the most important tribute to anybody is not the awards they got. It's the way everybody appreciated them. It's the way everybody learned to love them and to feel that he was a friend, a mentor, a colleague. Barry was, a titan, but I think he made each of us feel like like we were his colleagues, that we were his equals. We weren't, but he made us feel that way. And we could have a conversation with him about anything. And he would engage with us just like he was a student and we were a student, trying to bring us along. This is amazing when you think about it, for all that he was. It's something that we should all appreciate. He's left this legacy of all these students, colleagues, and collaborators, along with the books and articles and all the other stuff he has. But when it really comes down to it, what I'm going to remember him for is those 4 words I said earlier, that he was so kind. He was so competent. He was so curious throughout his life, and he was so collaborative. These are characteristics that transcend software engineering. They transcend academia or government or whatever. These are ones that we should all strive for in our lives, you know? So Barry served as a great role model for all of us as we go forward in our careers. And we can do great honor to him to be that way in our interactions with all the people we deal with, to be their mentors, to be their friends, and to help them in their careers. And I'm getting a little choked up, and I can see a few of you maybe too, as I say this, because he was just a great and interesting man, and we will miss him. And that's where I'll stop. I don't think I can say anything more.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Same thing was happening to me. I think everyone on this call getting a little bit choked up, but such a poignant and absolutely true reflection, and all the stories and how it interwove with your really great career. So just great keynote. Thank you so much for participating. And I'm going to, if anyone has any quick questions for Paul, otherwise we can turn it back over to Anandi for the continuation of the program. Or if people have comments, you can certainly put in the chat as well too, based on what you heard Paul say.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much. It was really an honor to be able to share a little time with you and to pay some tribute to this great man.
Thanks.